Well, thank you for having me. My name's Jarrett. I'm 49. I was born in North Saanich, went to Parklands and grad 93. I'm honored to live in this area, and I love it. And I was in the military for 24 years, did a lot of postings to Petawawa and Edmonton, but I came and went, and I'm glad to be home. And I'm doing exactly today what I've been wanting to do during my high school years, when I had a vision of my life. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Can you remember the summer you were 4 years old and going to a beach with your family? When I was 4 years old, I went to Coles Bay and found myself playing with some Pakwichan children. And all of a sudden, a whole fleet of Salish canoes came into Coles Bay. And I intuitively realized at that age that there were indigenous people in this area for thousands of years. And through my scouting, time in scouting, we had guest speakers. And I heard the legend of Claywilnook, the legend of the Great Flood, which happened in this area. And I've heard different versions of it. And it's best told by a Kwasanich storyteller, an elder. Today I'm going to tell a version kind of which I know, which explains the name Claywilnook. And Claywilnook is the name of Mount Newton. And Claywilnook is place of refuge, escape. And like I said, this legend should be told by Kwasanich elders, but I am taking the liberty to explain the legend, to explain the name Claywilnook, so that everybody has a complete and full understanding of Claywilnook. So it's guessed about 8,000 years ago, a great glacier dam up the Fraser Valley bursted, and it flooded right down, and it created everything that you know as the lower mainland. And the waters rushed up, and the waters went right to the top of the mountain. And half the people had been ready with their canoes, with supplies, cedar bark rope, salmon, and their babies and their elders. And half the population was probably wiped out. So they made their way to the summit and tied their canoes with a cedar bark rope to an arbutus tree. And sometime later, a raven flew around with a little stick in its mouth. And it landed on the bow of a canoe, and it seemed to be telling them something. And it went, Kwasanich! And they looked, and they saw the waters receding, and the land was emerging. And this is the name Saanich. Kwasanich, emerging land. When I was in high school, I thought that Saanich meant farmland, but it means emerging land, land which emerged from the flood. So the waters receded, they got out on the summit, and they said this area will be known as Kwasanich, the emerging land. And this mountain that saved our lives will be known as Claywilnook, the place of refuge, escape. So there you go. So today, you could say Mount Newton, you could say John Dean Park, you could say Claywilnook, or you could say place of refuge, escape. And I think for so many people that have lived here for a long time or who go up there today, who walk around, are escaping the world and just having time alone and thinking. Or people who experience loss. When you go up to Claywilnook, it's sort of like taking a blanket and wrapping it around you in terms of having that feeling of comfort by being taken refuge and escaping in really a truly amazing old growth forest. So the name of this talk, when I typed all this out on my computer, was Grand Old Park. Grand Old Park. And I thought that would be a really neat name, but it's occurred to me in the last couple of years that I've always known the place was a sacred place, but it's becoming more and more and more sacred as it becomes more rare in this area. So Europeans have been here for 18 decades. So 19 decades ago, this area was in absolute mint condition. And in 1852, when the Hudson Bay Company was turning over this area to the new Crown Colony of Vancouver Island, they completed surveys. And one was the North and South Saanich survey. So they went to the summit of Claywilnook, named the mountain after Mount Newton, who is a secretary at Hudson Bay Company, and they'd created North Saanich and South Saanich, and then east and west, and they had ranges, and they took sections out like that. So that was 72 and 77, the reserves were formally established, and then the remaining land was sold. And you hear the word settlers. People bought these 100-acre sections of land and cleared and farmed. And then as the decades went by, things got subdivided and roads put in, and here we are today. So if you take a look at all of the land between McTavish and Mount Newton, and East Saanich and West Saanich, it's about 16 sections, so 1,600 acres. In 1921, actually this building was built in 22, so to give you an idea, 1921, those 1,600 acres were mint. You could not tell that it had been dramatically touched. So John Dean gave 4/5 of his 100 acres, so 80 acres for park, and the theory was the other 20 would be added when he died. At that time, it didn't really mean anything because it was just 80 acres in the middle of 1,600 acres. 25 years later, the whole thing had been tremendously selectively logged, including the Paquetchon Reserve, and John Dean's 100 acres stood out like a sore thumb. And it just became more apparent that it was more special. So that was 21. Just a few years earlier, when John Dean retired, he built his cabin up there in the valley where there was a water supply and a flat area where he had his garden. And he named his cabin Ilahi. Ilahi is a word from a language Chinook, and Chinook was an indigenous European trading language spoken between the Oregon River and Squamish. And in the dictionary, it means country, earth, soil. Country, earth, soil. But when you take a more deeper, holistic look at Ilahi, and by learning indigenous thinking, it becomes apparent to myself that it's not just country, earth, soil, but the way we interact with it. It's our relationship with the place. And so to think that John Dean in 1910 took a word, Ilahi, that meant something to the indigenous people and named his cabin that as a country home, a place of retreat in the country, and our connection with that. So how are you doing, by the way? You guys liking this? Yeah. Okay. So there's lots to talk about, but I'll generally follow the timeline. So John Dean, between 1909 and 1938, spent about a third of his time there, so about 1,000 nights. And he built a small cabin and a second cabin, and joined the two together with a roof, and he had a covered wood area. He had a vegetable garden, fruit trees, 2 wells at the end of this little pond, a playground, benches, no electricity. He had a gramophone, a fireplace, lanterns. So you can imagine if you ever gone camping with no electricity, when the sun goes down, it's down. So you got your fireplace, and you got your candles, and you got your gramophone, and maybe a drink or two, and then you're going to bed. But he had a good time up there, and I'm certain, and well, it's obvious, that he knew that it was a special place. And the reason he donated it is because he knew that within another 20 years it would be logged. And his lifetime there was, well, he knew that it wasn't worth him getting, the equivalent of $400,000 today. That would not be enough for him to selfishly spend that and then not leave that to the future. So thank goodness it was done. So 1921, when he donated that park, it was the second piece of property that fell under the 1909 Park Act. Now there's other parks. There was the one at Vancouver, Stanley. There was Beacon Hill. Mount Doug was a Lieutenant Governor Reserve, which later became a park. But John Dean Park was the second park to fall under the Park Act. And it shows as the third park now because Mount Robson used to have its own statute park, and then it came under the Park Act. So John Dean is the third provincial park and the first donated. And that's pretty cool to say that we have that here. Of 1,030 provincial parks today, Dean Park was the first donated. And so when John Dean was in his 80s, he went down to the States for 3 months at a time, back for 6 months, down for 3 months, and he kind of went to Miami and places where it was warmer. Kept his house in Esquimalt. And then in 1939, what he did was he sold his 20-acre cabin site to his two best friends who were lawyers. And they had a deal that they would keep it and only sell it back into the park system when the park system could afford to buy it at about the same $1,200. So that was what you would call today a living will. And he very much assured that that living will would be carried out. And technically it was. 3 months after he died by accident, things lined up. 1943, in the middle of World War II, the province came up with $1,200 and bought that $20 or 20 acres and put it into, reunified the 100 acres. And it was called Dean Park. And the 1938 park development occurred between 36 and 38, and that's when they built the road up today. The parking lot, the main trails, the pond, the gazebo site, they put in a picnic site, fire pits, pit toilets, and signage. And they really did develop the park. And in fact, they did 21 parks on Vancouver Island to do with that 1936 to 38 development. And what that was, it was joint federal and provincial funded program for young men to inspire work programs. And what they did is these guys winged it, but they used a lot of common sense. And I'll get back to this common sense and the example in a few minutes. But they really did a good job. And then January 39 came, the program was defunded, World War II began shortly after, and the priority shifted from recreation to war. So here we are in the middle of World War II, and John Dean is 92. He's in the hospital and he essentially dies of old age. I like to think about that for a moment because I know that in World War I, he actually slipped on a rock at his cabin site and he cut that ligament in his knee. And he spent 9 months in the Jubilee Hospital reading World War I newspapers every day, followed the war quite closely. He would have had the self-awareness and the ability to follow World War II. And I do wonder what he was thinking in March of 43 when he died. You know, how would it end? I'm assuming he assumed that we would win. But can you imagine dying in the middle of a conflict like that after having lived a tremendous lifetime and not knowing how the future would roll out? So something to contemplate on. So after World War II, really not that many people went up to Dean Park. And it just sort of overgrew, the trails grew in, the water was running down the trails. People, high school students would go up and throw beer bottles in the bush, and up at the summit, garbage everywhere. And nobody's cleaning that stuff up. And that was your 50s and your 60s and your 70s, and nobody cared. And then the population started to grow. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But I just wanted to think about that. 30 years of just nobody caring. So what happened in World War II is they created 2 expropriations at the summit. They're squares, 200 feet by 200 feet. And that's today's radar towers. One was a transmitter site, and one was diesel engines to power the transmitter. And so war measures expropriated those 2 little sites at the summit and built that gravel road up to the top that you know of today. And then again, after World War II, there was almost no use for those sites, so everything was removed. And then around the late 70s, the Coast Guard had the technology to build that Coast Guard radar tower, the one that you see that goes around. So that went on the transmitter site. And then in 1986, the airport system installed that golf ball radar tower that you can see, which is an airport type of radar. There's 39 of those from Alaska to California, and they monitor all the airplanes. So that's how you can have radar towers inside a park because of the World War II expropriation. And then, okay, so early 1980s, Dean Park Estates was being installed road by road, and some really neat people were moving here from across the province, highly educated people who had time. And they went up to Dean Park, and what did they find? Garbage, water running on the trails, neglect, abuse for motorbikes ripping all over the place. Okay, there's new garbage, and then there's old garbage. So new garbage is something that's been thrown down in the last year. Old garbage is anything from a year to 40 years, okay? So the initial cleanup began, and a good bunch of people in their 60s cleaned up the place in the early 80s. And they created a Friends of John Dean Park, and they did a measure on the main trails to stop the water from running. And then what they did is they had a vision of a park plan, and that was to install an outer perimeter trail, and that became 4 trails. And they went in 1987, 88. And then I came along in 89. And then in 1990, helped build the 4th trail called the Selectane Trail. And what happened there is I was in grade 10, and I was a major volunteer, and I was invited onto the Friends of John Dean Executive. And all of a sudden, just like you 4, I became the secretary. And I was in grade 10. And I could barely even spell. And I remember not even knowing how to take minutes. But I was in a leadership kind of position, and I got to contribute. And what I realized was the first 3 trails were named after people. Barrett Montfort, a fellow who donated 186 acres. The Woodwards department store gave 80. And Sidney Pickles, the first mayor of the newly created Central Saanich, who gave Pickles Bluff that 22 acres. And what was the 4th trail going to be called? And I was really thinking Thunderbird Trail because I went to the Camp Thunderbird in Souk. But I was aware that just a year earlier, the hereditary chief of Paquitchin died, and his last name was Williams. And his Senchathan name was Selectane. And Selectane is the rock that's in Coles Bay. If you're out in the Saanich Inlet and boating into Coles Bay, it's that big boulder island out there at the end, and it's a landmark. And so that was the Selectane. So what I'm trying to say is we, in 1990, put a hereditary chief's name in Senchathan in the park. And we named the trail going from the parking lot Thunderbird Trail and Raven Creek. And when you think about it today, that was 30 years ago. So we were sort of ahead of our times, and I'm really proud of that. And it's just one of those things that everyone knows that happened, but it's just the way it is. But there we go. And I'm kind of actually proud we have that done in John Dean Park. So the name, can everybody say Claywilnook? Right. So Claywilnook, and I'm always saying that because we got to get people to say Claywilnook. I think it's a much more cooler name than Mount Newton. And I'm actually noticing it today when the youngest people go up there. They're finding the place much more interesting because it has that kind of history that they can kind of identify with and wonder about. How are we doing for time?
You're doing good.
Another 10 minutes?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So between my grade 10 and age 24, I got to work really closely with a retired forester. His name was Ado Nyland. And him and I were really good friends. And he was the founder of the Friends of John Dean Park. And he really sort of taught me a lot of what I know. I think I got into it actually with the thinking and the mindset of, caring for a place or draining water off the trail or building a more sustainable trail. But to actually work with this guy was really cool. And, and like, I guess what happens is everybody ages out. And then in my 30s, a guy appeared on the scene, Andrew Mitchell. And he was a retired forester also, and he lived in Deep Cove. And him and I did some projects up there, kind of like, 5 days a year for 12 years in a row. But so you get to work with these guys who really know what they're doing. And one of the things Andrew taught me about that his uncle taught him way back in Scotland, like 150 years ago, his uncle's grandfather or something that had taught him how to build a stone wall. Now, if you have a trail that's sloped, okay, and you're walking this way, okay, what you do is you dig down a little bit on the lower side and you put in these rocks, much like you would stack firewood on a slightly inward thing like this, and then you build up. And you interlock it like you stack a firewood. And we've done probably 20 of these in the park, which really narrows down the whole trail. It provides a safer and smoother, definitely not muddy walking surface. And people are staying on the trails instead of off the trail because they want to stay on the trail because it's easier to walk. Anyway, you could drive a tank on these walls. And that's another testament to these old guys, or maybe even ladies back in Scotland who have done this forever. And then, for me to learn this. So I just wanted to mention that because it's kind of a neat thing that's happened to me, and it's a neat thing that's now in the park because the park is totally sorted out. Actually, how many people here go up there? Okay, so probably about 10. So it looks like about a third of the room. But that's pretty cool. Go up one evening in the summer. It's just awesome. One thing I can tell you is that when I was in my early 20s, I was in the Army Reserves, and I made $10 an hour cutting grass. And that period of my life, I did all the research on the park, and I got a whole bunch of old photographs. And thank goodness I did that at the time I did it because well, it takes time, it takes energy and commitment. And then what happened, if I had have had waited 20 years, a lot of these old ladies had passed on. And then these pictures would just be vanished. But there's one guy I met who lived over by Hope, and his name was Davy Davidson. And he was the last guy to reside 2 days a week in John Dean's cabin before they tore it out in '57. And I went to visit him, and I thought he would be this big, mighty parks forester. And I get to his door, and he's this little old guy, and he's round, but he knew a lot about parks and park development and standards and sustainability, trails, and he'd worked in Manning Park and in several other prominent provincial parks. And so him and I really hit it off. And he had this big laundry basket full of pictures, and he pulls out this envelope with about 20 pictures of John Dean Park, and that's much what's in the book. And if anybody wants that book, just send me an email and I'll give it to you for free. Or if you want a second one, it's just $10 for my cost. But there's some beautiful old photographs. And I was absolutely like, wow. Like I couldn't believe, because what was happening to me is I was getting one picture at a time, and then all of a sudden a gold mine. So that's how it all came together. And looking back on that period of my life as early 20s, I know I didn't waste my time. That's just what I want to say. Okay, so the original name was Dean Park. And then when the road went up, it was commonly being referred to as John Dean Park. And that was fine, so it was technically legally Dean Park. Everybody said John Dean Park. In 1957, the province made that every provincial park would be called Provincial Park, so John Dean Provincial Park. And in 2019, much thanks to Adam Olson, our MLA, was able to do something through the Park Amendment Act, which is, Park Amendment Act is how you change a park boundary or a name, and it was an additive process. So we added the name Claywilnook. So Claywilnook, John Dean Park. And that's where we are today. And it's almost like, we just had the centennial in 1921. And you know how you, in your life, if you get older and you accumulate assets and knowledge and family, and so you can see how this name is getting bigger, huh? It goes Dean Park, John Dean Park, Provincial Park, Claywilnook, John Dean. So anyway, I just want to tell one quick story. When 2011-12, every once in a while I'll pull a little piece of garbage out of the ground. And finally I said, what is this? So about 50 feet south of where Dean's cabin was, what they did is when they tore the cabin down, what they did is they went inside the cabin and they took out everything, glass, metal, and they threw it on top of the ground at the base of this big old growth Douglas fir tree. And I'm pulling out all kinds of stuff and filling it in buckets and even bricks, right? So everything's going out. And I couldn't get this piece of metal out of the ground. So I got my pick and I went like that and pulled this thing out. And you can see the hole here. And I'm looking at this thinking it was part of a tin roof. Flipped it over and I couldn't believe it. And wait till you see the pictures. Can everybody read what this says? Yeah. So that's the 1918 sign. And if anyone wants to come and have a look at this after, by all means. In fact, please touch it because it is 1918. I think I'm going to own it for another 10 years, and then I'm going to give it to the Saanich Pioneer Museum in Saanich, and will be the actual true owner of it over time. Yeah. So, 2 more minutes? Sure. Okay, so have you guys enjoyed this? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. The last thing I just wanted you guys to know, since you live here, you have an invested interest in the area, and obviously you love the park because you showed up today, that long-time stewardship has really put that place into a first-class condition. So there's no invasive plants. And I was just told a few years ago the place is now a museum. It's the only property you can go into and you open your eyes and you do not see invasive plants. So there's no holly, daphne, blackberry, broom, and holly. It's all out all the time. And we've definitely now passed that 25-year seed bank exhaustion point. So just when we went through the park the last couple of months, we're pulling the very end of what was an unbelievable amount of broom. It was so bad. In 1995, we were pulling broom that was this high, the size of my wrist, and out it comes, and then next year there'll be 1,000 babies. So just over and over and over again. So the meadows in that park are truly spectacular. And if you go up there in May, June, half of them explode in wildflowers. So it's the place is cared for. And I just hope that after I die, someone continues. But that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Jarrett?
Okay. My question is, the university had some property up there and built the Ravensview Lodge. Is it there or is it gone? Because it was on the base of...
Yep. Oh yeah, Ravensview is there today. And that's a really neat thing because there you go. Place of refuge, escape, healing. Mm-hmm. And when the people that stay there, I think for 2 to 3 months, they go on walks in the park. Yeah. And there they are, taking refuge and healing and escaping, and it's wonderful.
Okay. No, I lost contact with it. My husband was in geography department at UVic, and we were quite involved in that and wondered just what was, I haven't been up there since, so yeah. Good to know. Thank you.
Please welcome Ray Travers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here this evening with you, and I already tell that you enjoy each other's company, so I'll just assume that I'm one of you. Yes, my wife and I and our 2 children did move to East Saanich, to the Gordon Head area in 1974, but my grandmother and her second husband moved to Royal Oak in 1937. So this gives me the opportunity this evening to share with you not only my grandmother's family, but other Travers family that were part of that, and we'll get into that in a moment. There are actually 4 Travers family members who were here from about 1937 to about 1955 or so. And some of you do know I call him my cousin. He's really my dad's cousin. I was explaining to Heather earlier that she says, well, isn't he about the same age as you? Well, he is, but he's the earlier generation. So I said, well, he was born when his dad was about 60. So that makes him for the earlier generation. So that's how that has worked out. So why don't we get into my presentation? I'd be happy to just roll through it, and then we can open it up afterwards to whatever information we can discuss. And I'm here tonight probably to learn as much from you as perhaps I share with you in this presentation, because the reality is that I never really lived in Royal Oak. My family lived in Royal Oak, and we've lived in East Saanich or Gordon Head since we arrived in '74. So, okay, my son and I, who's Michael or Mike, we have done a lot of research on my Travers surname, and as I'll get into it, we're English on that side. And we actually have our own website, and they were from Lancashire. So if you'd like to see a sampling of the research that we've done, if you have a family with similar history from Lancashire, with their experience in the Industrial Revolution and so on, you can find that information there. So next, and if my voice does drop off a little bit, please let me know that you can't hear me. So next. Okay, the Travers surname, where did it come from? Well, of course, these things are lost in legend. But the legend is, it goes back to Norman times, from William the Conqueror and so on, and the people with my surname came along at that time. It means to cross or to traverse. I know as a forester, I would quite often be out with fellows and they would talk about running Travers. You know what a running Travers is? It means that you move through the bush. Well, what I would usually say, I say, well, you guys can run, but this Travers is going to walk. Okay. And then, of course, the legend is that we collected money from travelers at a ford in a river or bridge or a city gate. So that's gives you a little bit of where I'm coming from. So next, please. And during the Industrial Revolution, my family were watchmakers and chronometer makers, a very sophisticated type of watch for many years. And what's really interesting as my son and I got into this research, occasionally, not a lot, you can still buy some of their watches on eBay. So it's really exciting when that happens, when you find out something. And of course you know that it was one of their watches because their names are inscribed on it and the year. So there's no question that they are my ancestors. So what happened was that the chronometers, of course, were used by sailing ships to accurately navigate wherever they were going. Basically, so they could go out and find their way back home again. And so what happened was that with the invention of radio, that whole trade went out of existence overnight. It'd be like GPS today. And so that's probably why I'm here, because my grandfather and his family no longer had a trade, because that one had disappeared. So next, please. Okay, my Travers family arrived in Canada during the last best West Canadian immigration policy. Probably a number of you came to Western Canada at the same time, 1895, 1905, 1915, in that era. And you can see that there were actually a large number of people in the family, but these are the only ones who came and for a time, and most of them stayed. But there was Ruth, Oliver, my grandfather, Sydney, who moved and lived here for a time, and then my great uncle Charles, and then there were 2 others, Frank and Frederick. And so you can see the period of time that they arrived in Canada. Initially it was, of course, to, I guess what was the Northwest Territories prior to Alberta becoming a province. And then, of course, those who arrived after 1905, the province had been established. So next, please. During this period of time when my grandfather, Oliver Travers, and one of his younger brothers, Sidney Travers, who moved here for a while, they were a couple of the crazy guys who tried to make it to the Klondike through Edmonton. Now, in hindsight, it was just a bad idea. Of the 1,500 who started, only, I think, 10% of them made it. And the ones who made it had to go down by river, not by land, and it took them 2 years. Now, not surprisingly, most didn't make it, including my grandfather and his brother. They turned back after about 6 months or so. But anyway, we have a website on that if you want to check it out. It's traverslancashire.net, and then there's a subtitle, The Helpman Klondike in Expedition. So next, please. Anyway, this is Sidney Travers, who moved here. He was one of the Klondikers, and this is taken in Edmonton about 1897. So that whole era, if I can put it this way, I was raised on stories about the Klondike because of the Trail of 98 and so on, so it had an imprint in who I am. Next, please. And this, of course, is the party that was about to head off, and this was taken right on the grounds of where the Alberta legislature buildings exist today, and there you can see the party. Now, what was really, quite frankly, dumb, they didn't get going until March. Well, you can realize if you're going 2,500 miles to Dawson City, theoretically, and you're not leaving until March, well, the snow isn't going to be there for after another month or so, so it's no wonder that they got into trouble. None of the horses survived. None of them. Okay. All of the men survived, but as far as we know. That's got started. But anyway, that's kind of it. What the amazing things that people will do if there's just a very small chance that you can get really, really rich. Next, please. Okay. My grandmother, and I focused my presentation around her. She's kind of the common thread through all of this. Anna, and she was French-Canadian, Dumont, and my grandfather, they got married in 1902 at Hobbema near Wetaskiwin, and she was my grandmother. And that's my grandfather sitting there, Oliver Travers, and my first name is Oliver, so I got it from him. Next, please. But we lost him in World War I on the 29th of October, 1917. And so, of course, that had a dramatic impact on my family for reasons that I still don't really know the full scope of it. All I really know is that it had a huge impact, and probably we were not alone. We're not alone. Most families were affected in some way by World War I. This one, we were affected very deeply. But he got the Military Cross, and on the bottom of there, in the family inscription, it says, "Far from home and loved ones, he gave his life for freedom." Okay, so that's my grandfather's sacrifice, what he did in World War I. He was with a battalion from Edmonton. Next, please.
Where is that cemetery?
Oh, that's in West Flanders. It's New Brandhoek Military Cemetery number 3. What it was, to give you some sense, the battlefields were a little further to the east, and he was a quartermaster, which meant he was moving around, okay? And he was probably got by a sniper, I would guess, and he probably survived for a while. But this is a small cemetery on the way back to the English Channel, and he's buried there in a cemetery of about 300 graves. So that's what we know about him. So anyway, the Travers of Royal Oak. There was Anna. What happened was that when we lost my grandfather, my grandmother Anna married his brother Charles in 1926, I think it was, and they stayed in the Gruard area, Lesser Slave Lake area of northern Alberta. And the interesting thing is that many of them were there for 20 or 30 years. They finally got the message that it was not a prosperous place to live. They pulled out prior to oil, and they moved here, okay, mainly in the 30s. So there was Anna and Charles. They arrived in the West Saanich Road area about 1937, and then her brother-in-law, Sidney Sr. and Clara, and there's the family there, Ed, Harry, and Dick. Now, Dick is the only one of that generation who's still with us. And the reason, as I explained earlier, is that his dad was 60 years old or so when he was born. And then there was children of Anna and Oliver. The eldest one was Sidney. I called him Sidney Jr., and they had 5 children. And we'll get into some of the details of them. Ed lived in the Meadowbrook Lane area west of Prospect Lake. I really don't know a lot about it. All I know is that that's where his property was, and I do know that he left there with his family about 1975 or so. So anyway, we'll get into more of these details here in a minute. Just next, please. Okay, Anna and Charles. I've already said some of this, and I quite frankly don't know exactly where their house was. I think Heather was telling me, or someone was telling me, that it was probably close to Heatherdale Lane. All that my cousin Dick has told me, it was on a side road where the new Royal Oak School was built. And so if you can help me out as to exactly where that was, that would be of real interest to me. So next, please. Okay, now my son looked at this, and there's an error here. The 1941 census has not yet been released. This was the 1941 electoral registry, is what it was. But you can see the names of Charles, my great uncle. It says Mrs. Charles, that's Anna, and then her brother-in-law and sister-in-law also living at Royal Oak, and of course Royal Oak 1. We don't know exactly where that was, but that's the information that I have. Okay, so next, please. Okay, here's the home of Anna and Charles, and I imagine that this is a fairly typical style home for this area at that time, sort of, I guess what you call half-timbered or whatever. But anyway, this was their home, probably close to Heatherdale Road. Next, please. And these are just a series of photographs that we have of their life there. And I don't know who these other people are in the picture. I just know that there's Anna second from the left, and that's Charles on the right. He also was a military man from the Edmonton Regiment, but he came back from the war. So, next, please. Obviously, they spent a lot of time in the yard. There's Charles in the yard, probably somewhere around 1945 or so. Next, please. Now, in the family of Anna and Oliver, my grandparents, there were 6 boys. Sidney was the eldest, and I called him Sidney Jr. Their 4th son was Percy, that's my dad. And then another one of my uncles is another Oliver in the family, that's him on the right. And he lived in North Vancouver at the time, and as my grandmother and her second husband were getting to about 70 years of age, he persuaded them to move to North Vancouver, so that's where they moved from here. Next, please. And there's Alice with Charles and Anna, also taken in the yard, probably about 1945, 1946 or so. Okay, next, please. And this is, of course, one of their grandchildren. His grandson Dennis. If you look real carefully, you can see him sitting in the trees there, and they're both probably an apple tree or whatever it is that they're having a good time in. So next, please. Okay, this is where I'm really interested to share this information with you. When I say Sidney Jr., you know, that's Anna's oldest son. That's my dad's oldest brother, okay? And they came here from they call it the Peace River country. He was attracted here during the war to work in the dockyards. That's why he arrived here. They lived in the Prospect Lake store, and as far as I know, they owned it for a year or two. Because, and I have his memoirs here, and that's what he says. He drove horses for tally-ho wagons. They had the children there, you can see their names. And then they moved back to the Peace River country, and then they retired here to the Victoria area in 1974. And they're both buried just 5 minutes away here in the Royal Oak Burial Park close to the crematoria there. I just went over this evening and visited their graves briefly. So next, please. Okay, here's their family. Again, this is my uncle, my dad's eldest brother. This is Sidney and his wife Dolly and their 5 children. And they lived on the in the Prospect Lake store for a while, and then I'm told that they sort of moved back and forth to the home of her grandmother and my grandmother, Anna, close to, I'm told, is somewhere close to the Institute Hall, Women's Institute Hall. Next, please. Okay, here's Anna's brother-in-law, her husband's younger brother, Oliver. He's the Klondike guy. This is the Sydney Syria guy who tried to go to the Klondike with my grandfather. And according to Dick, he said he lived in a big rental house on West Saanich Road owned by the Melishes. Now, I'm told by others that that's a name familiar to you. Okay, you know that name? Okay. And then the graves of Sidney and Claire, they're both in Ross Bay Cemetery. So they never left this area after they arrived. Okay, next please. Sidney Sr. was quite a traveler. This is a visit that he made to New Zealand, and the reason he went there is that one of their family members emigrated to New Zealand at about the same time that they emigrated to Canada. So next please. And of course we start to get into the younger generations. Here's the eldest son of Sidney and Clara, Ed, and he married Joan Broadhurst. I believe she still lives at Vista Heights in Victoria. If she's not there, it's because I've lost touch. But we lost Ed about 10 years ago. I can send you his obituary. I do have that information. But that was the family that lived on Meadowbrook Lane. Okay, next please. Yeah, there we are. Okay, and that's about all that I know about these folks. Okay, if you know more, that would be of real interest to me. Okay, next please. Okay, here's the fellow that we do know quite well, who is my dad's cousin and probably my second cousin, but anyway, born in 1934. He said he attended school at Royal Oak Elementary. Grade 5, attended the new Royal Oak School. He said Miss Phillips, is that a name we know? Okay, we know that, was the teacher. He said that Alma Jackson would remember, Dick. Is she someone that all the rest of us know here? Okay, and then he worked on towboats and princess boats in the 1950s, and then later, my understanding is that he went into construction, and Heather told me that she took care of his accounting tasks after that, and he still lives in Duncan. Okay, I visit him, I don't know, a couple times a year. He just loves this family history stuff, so that's what keeps us together. Next, please. Okay, then in the later years of Anna and Charles living here in Victoria, they sold the property on Royal Oak and moved close to Tillicum Mall. Kerr Avenue is located there. Now, that house is no longer there. I went by there a few years ago. There's a new house on that property, but you can see them there in the yard. Okay, so, and then after that, they moved to North Vancouver. Next, please. Okay, just a couple of wind-up slides here. I mentioned to you that both my grandfather Oliver and his brother, one of his brothers Charles, were served with the what was called the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the 49th Battalion. Charles did come back and married my grandmother, and at this time I'm a citizen volunteer with Saanich Archives for something called the Saanich Remembers Project, and we're all invited to do this. So if you have relatives, ancestors, whoever, friends or whatever, you can find them on the website, the Saanich Remembers Project. And what this project is all about is that just after World War I, an honor roll was developed, and there were 355 names on it. Now, I always have trouble getting my head around. There only were 5,000 people in all Saanich at that time. So 355 names, and we think that's low. We think that it's probably closer to 700 names. But anyway, the whole idea is to update this honor roll. We'll have a number of activities this fall, some lectures and so on. And what we're all invited to do is to put on file their military information. And that'll become part of the permanent records of Saanich Archives. so that you want your military relatives to be documented and to have that information. They were all invited to do that, and I've done that with my great uncle Charles. So next, please. And then just to wrap up, this is the grave. When my grandmother Anna, in her very late years, after she had lost her second husband, Charles, she remarried a man by the name of Dave McMahon, and they lived in Esquimalt, and her grave is just over here, just 5 minutes away, walk. And so she's in that grave, identified as Anna McMahon. So there we are, kind of gone full circle from when they arrived to where she now is remembered with this plaque in Royal Oak Burial Park. And I'd be happy to respond to any comments or questions that you have. That's basically an overview of what my son and I know about our 4 Travers family members that lived in here. When I say 4, there was Anna and Charles, there was Sidney and Clara, there was Ed, and then there was Dick. Okay, and so that's what I mean by the 4 members of my family. So thank you, Amy, for inviting me. It's been fun to share what I know with you. I'm delighted to be able to donate this book to you. We had an extra one. This is the memoirs, the life history of my dad's oldest brother, Sidney Jr. And so, Eden, would you like to accept this on behalf of the One of the things that I'm a forester, so I'm very interested in the Shelburne memorial trees. Are you familiar with what they are? You know, they're the London plane trees. And the initial idea was to plant them all the way from Mount Doug down to Bay Street. And today we've only got 1/3 of them left. And the reason for that is that post-World War II, when Shelburne was widened from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, we lost a big chunk of it. Now the people of Victoria from Hillside South have taken real good care of those trees. But north of that, I think if the citizens had objected from Torquay North, we would have lost those too. But we don't. They're there, and they're from a forestry point of view, they were a good choice. They're very tolerant to abuse, lopping and things like that, or kids with vandalism tendencies and so on. And so they will last 200 or 300 years. We're committed. You know, we're going to be at this project for the next 5 years. You know, to make sure that we learn everything we can. And one of the main objectives of the activity is to try and understand the impact of the war on the people of Saanich. You know, we're not going to get that much into what was going on in Europe, but what we were really interested in is what the effect was on the people back home. And so anything along that line about, well, it's just some amazing stories. One of the amazing stories that Carolyn found was that the young men who were working for Saanich when the war broke out and they weren't married, got pig slips. They were terminated. And so she is an example of the letter basically saying, because you're not enlisted, you no longer have a job. So it was rough. It was rough for a lot of people, for what they had to put up with. What I did learn in terms of, I guess, my understanding of our government, provincial government, after the war was over, really tried to do the right thing for the returning veterans. There were a number of nursing homes established, and then also there was a major land program. A lot of the early irrigation projects, like in the Okanagan and in the Fraser River with the Pitt River and so on, and here on the island, they were started by the provincial government land program at the time, like Merville up here, near close to Canada. That's a name from the French battlefields. That's why that name is there. That's a battlefield name. So at any rate, it's just an amazing story what our forebears had to cope with. And as you know, when Britain declared war, I think it was the 2nd of August, 1914, we were automatically in it. We didn't have a choice. And then the mobilization that occurred is just amazing, that somehow people dug deep and found the resources to send their very best and brightest over there, and many didn't return home. So does any of your family go back to the 30s and 40s, 50s? That we could have a chat and maybe you can help me, get at least, I'd like to have the basics, at least where they lived, exactly. and then whatever organizations my family may have been involved in at the time. And of course, we'll start with my grandmother because she's kind of the central figure in my story.
I think the house they lived in, where he says on the side road by the new Royal School.
Right.
That house is still there.
Oh, is
It's
it?
the one I'm thinking of.
Oh,
It's
is it?
on the driveway down.
Is it on Heatherdale?
No, it's, what do they call it now? Trevino Lane.
Oh, I see, Trevino, okay.
Right across from the end of Pipeline.
Oh, I'll take a drive over
And
there and
there's
see
a
if I can.
church there
Right.
and then the house.
Okay. Yeah, I know that
That could be it.
my cousin Elizabeth, like that was, Sydney and Dolly's daughter, who's my age. She told me stories about riding her bicycle from Prospect Lake store down to visit our grandmother's house and going back and forth along the Sandwich Road. So. Well, that's it. It's been my pleasure to be here, and hopefully we've started something here that will help me out and you out to learn a little bit more about this wonderful area that we all live in.